Hello, this is Tony Blazier for the Motocross Vault presented by Blinzall. If you're in the market for some high-quality racing oil for your two-stroke or four, make sure you go to blinzall.com and use our discount code VAULT20 to save 20% at checkout. Thank you for all the support. Hello and welcome back to the Motocross Vault. My name is Tony Blazier, and what this video is going to cover is a look back at the history of Kawasaki's open class two-strokes. The KX400, KX450, KX420, and KX500. Now Kawasaki was one of the first manufacturers to kind of jump into the motocross game in the early to mid-60s, but they really didn't get going in the 500 class till the mid-80s. The early 70s bikes were not very well regarded. Pretty poor machines. In fact, they discontinued making them altogether for several years. Actually, at two occasions, they ditched the 500s altogether. So they definitely had some rough times when they were first starting out. But eventually, the KXs turned into be like the best open class bikes available. Basically, from '88 until the demise of the KX500 in 2004, it was considered the best of the Japanese 500s. It had a little more advanced motor than the Honda had. The suspension typically in that era was better as well. The bodywork was a little bulky and what have you, but they're great open class machines. My best friend Jamie Conrad has a really cherry 88 right now, and when you ride it, it's really impressive bike. It's actually not nearly as terrifying as some of the Hondas I've had. The motor's much smoother, easier to ride. I love open class bikes in spite of the fact that they frighten me sometimes. They can be a handful, but if you know how to ride them fast, and ride them well, you can go really fast on these bikes. Really, the open class is the new standard now. I mean, all these 450 four-strokes are just open class bikes. The motors are just a little smoother than the old two-strokes were. Power-wise, are actually pretty close in terms of total output, but they have a much broader power curve. That was one of the problems with these early, two-strokes. They had a hard time making the power, so it would easy to control. The poor suspension in the early 70s, the very flexy chassis really couldn't handle the power these engines were capable of putting out, and it caused some pretty scary machines like the famous TM 400 Cyclone from Suzuki, and some of the early Hondas weren't very good either. So these 500s, for a long time, people revered them as like the premier class. Eventually, the smaller machines kind of took them over, but for many years, the 500s were considered the pinnacle of the sport in terms of motorcycle development. And this Kawasaki video is going to be similar to the ones I've done with the KDX. I've done one with the Honda CR250, several other machines where I'm just going to go through year by year. It's not going to be an in-depth review of each year. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the motorcycle. If it's a really important one, I might mention a little more than others. Some, obviously, especially through the 90s, there really wasn't much in the way of updates. Really, graphics and a few suspension tweaks are really all they were doing on them. They kind of, the Japanese more or less gave up on the 500 class until the four-strokes came out. So the later ones, not nearly as much, but early on, particularly in the 80s, they were making some pretty big changes year over year. And I'm going to go into a little bit of what they changed each year, talk about the bike in general, and that's really what this review is going to be. Now, if you'd like to support what I do here at the Motocross Vault, I have Motocross Vault merch available, including several Kawasaki designs. I did one with Jeff Ward's, like a 85 KX in the back of a truck. I've done a history of the Kawasaki, basically showing the iconic machines as they go through time, basically taking an evolution. That's available in a poster and shirts and what have you. I also did a kind of a one I really like with Ricky Carmichael's. One of my favorite bikes is 2001 Chevy Trucks Kawasaki, kind of a tribute design to that. So if you'd like to support what I do and check out my Teespring store, I'll put a card in the video here and also a link in the description below. So here, without further ado, is the history of Kawasaki's open class two-stroke machines. In 1973, Kawasaki introduced a all-new open class machine, the F-12MX. And this is kind of one of the first, serious forays into open class motocross. Now, this machine was extremely limited production. They only made about 150 of them. Brad Lackey raced it. It was a bike that really was kind of almost like an experiment for Kawasaki, I think, initially. I imagine with 150 of them produced, it was probably almost impossible to find one. Kawasaki did this a lot in the 70s. Again, I would say they weren't all in on motocross at this point. Several years they had very limited production machines, and basically if you didn't know somebody at the factory or weren't like a local pro, you probably weren't going to get one. And this F12 is certainly that way. Now the bike was fairly advanced for its time. It used a nice strong chromoly steel frame, had magnesium hubs, used these very unique Kiaba hammerhead rear shocks with this weird little reservoir here on the back of the shock. It was, again, a pretty cool bike for its time. The tank and the fenders were plastic, which was fairly unique for the time. A lot of times motocross bikes used fiberglass or metal at this point. So the bike was pretty cool in terms of the appearance. It looks neat. I don't think it was a very much of a performer though. I couldn't find any real tests of it. Motocross Action got to ride it a little bit like in the dunes, but they didn't have a full test. But again, this was almost like an experiment this year. But for 1974, they ramped up production on the F-12 and rebranded it as the KX450. The KX450 is almost identical. There's not really much in the way of changes for 1974. Travel is very modest. It has 5.25 inches of travel from the forks and only 2.5 inches of travel in the back. So you're definitely not going to want to be hitting any massive jumps on this machine. It used a 441cc two-stroke mill. Kawasaki claimed horsepower to be 38 horsepower at 5,500 RPMs. When I read Motocross Action's test of this bike, they were very underwhelmed. Said it was very low on power, had a lot of torque. Basically ran like an enduro bike. They were not impressed with it. Didn't care much for the handling of the suspension or anything. So, unfortunately, this first KX450 not a great machine, but certainly an important machine in terms of the start of the Kawasaki KX Open Class story. After a rather lackluster outing in 1974, Kawasaki was back with an all-new machine for 1975. Rebranded the KX400, Kawasaki downsized the displacement somewhat from 441 cc's to 401 cc's, and also upped the size of the carburetor from 34 millimeters to 36. Now this was done to kind of punch up the top-end power. As I said, in 1974, the KX450 was known as a tractor that didn't really have much pull past the low end. It ran kind of like a big enduro bike. Wasn't particularly popular with riders for motocross use. So this year, they actually raised the RPM ceiling. It goes about 1,000 RPMs higher before it cuts everything off. And the motor was said by Kawasaki to punch out a little over 3 more horsepower. The bike is still not a top-end screamer. It is, of course, an open class bike. I think they, at least by most accounts of what I've read, the motor was a little bit more pleasant and punchy this year. Still not a screamer by any means, though. For 1975, you also get a little more suspension travel. You get an all-new frame. Up front, the suspension goes to 7.6 inches, which is about 2 inches more than they had the year before. And they laid down the shocks slightly as well, and punches out just shy of 4 inches of travel in the back. So pretty substantial improvement in terms of overall travel. I still don't think the suspension action was very good. Reading the tests, it seems like they were very prone to fading. And the bike was not known for handling very well. It said the turning is pretty much terrible on these things. Again, these early Kawasaki open class bikes are by no means the best machines in the class. In fact, they're mostly made fun of by the magazines. They weren't really thought of very well. So in 1975, they did make some improvements in terms of the overall design, but I don't think the actual performance turned out to be much better. For 1976, we get a subtle change in graphics. You get this kind of cool lightning bolt effect on the tank. I do like the looks of these bikes overall. They're pretty handsome for their era, obviously. By modern standards, they look cobby, but I think that this is a pretty good looking motorcycle. Like I said, I do like these graphics. Other than that, there's really no substantial changes that I could see from reading the tests and looking at some of the specs. Doesn't look like they made any updates for 1976 other than the graphics. The KX, as I said, was not a very popular machine, and Kawasaki actually would stop making the 400 after this year. This would be the last year for the KX400. Again, I don't think this thing took off. Again, I was reading a test here when Super Hunky was just raking it over the coals, talking about how the forks and shocks faded immediately. The motor just had a nice belch down low and just fell on its face, didn't pull very far, and handled like a runaway truck. So again, not a well-regarded machine, I don't think, by the press at the time. And Kawasaki kind of went with their tail between their legs into a couple of seasons of retirement in the open class after 1976. After the 1976 season, Kawasaki took a full 3 years off in the open class division. Now, over that time, there was a huge amount of change in terms of motocross design. Now, they did offer a 1978 and 79, 250 and 125. They actually produced no machines in 77, took the entire 77 season off. But in 78, they came out with an all-new KX125 and 250 that were big improvements for the brand. Certainly by far the most competitive machines Kawasaki had ever offered. The 79 models were both very competitive machines, although, again, very limited production. The 78 and 79s, basically you had to know somebody or have some connection to the factory to even get one. It's kind of weird. No bikes in 77, very limited production in 78 and 79. For 1980, they came back with an all-new lineup of machines featuring the industry's first linkage rear suspension system, the Unitrack. Now Kawasaki at this point, again, definitely not at the cutting edge of motocross design by most counts. They're kind of a niche player. So it's interesting that they were the first one to kind of jump into these waters. And again, motocross design had just taken a quantum leap forward from 1976. This 1980 KX420 actually shares some of its roots in terms of the motor design from the original KX400. But they did add a lot of technology to it. In the 1976 model, it's a piston port design. There's no reed valve. Here by 1980, you have a reed valve in the 420 motor. The engine is a little more powerful, a little bigger in terms of size too. It's 422 cc's this year. Still, obviously, a single cylinder, air cooled, nothing fancy, no power valve or anything. The motor runs kind of a mid-range only. I don't think any of the magazines much cared for the way it ran. The power band was very narrow. They described it as riding like a big, overly powerful 125 where you had to shift it a lot. Maybe not the ideal power band. Certainly most people thought the YZ465 this year had a much better open class power band. The chassis itself is all new. Again, they went to the Unitrack this year. Travel had grown hugely in the 3 years since the 76 models have come out. This new KX420 put out 12 inches of travel front and rear, which is a huge jump up. It's more than double in the rear, certainly, from the 1976 model, and still 5 or 6 inches more than they had up front as well. The forks, of course, are larger in diameter to go along with the longer travel. They had to kind of beef up the suspension to take the more leverage that the longer forks and shock had on the frame. Frame is beefed up as well to basically be able to handle all that torque being put on it by the long travel suspension. The KX is very tall and long. Again, not much of a handler. They were having Kawasaki was having some problems with trying to get their bikes to handle. Pretty much from the 70s up through maybe the mid to late 80s, none of the bikes were considered great handlers, and this 1980 is certainly no exception in that regard. It's a very tall and long feeling bike, has a kind of a tippy feel. The Unitrack in the rear does offer very good absorption for big jumps, but of course, by modern standards, it probably would feel like a marshmallow. If you originally these old bikes, they feel soft, but in 1980, they thought the shock was way too stiff. Most of the tests I read rated the monoshock Yamaha far above this in terms of performance. The shock was very high tech. This monoshock linkage design certainly pointed the way forward for suspension design, but this first one, it only offered compression damping adjustability, and it seems like the performance wasn't really great out of the crate. I think some of the magazines said you get a reputable tuner to kind of dial it in, it worked pretty well, but out of the crate it was a little too stiff, and they weren't super happy with the overall performance. They also complained that the motor shook like a paint shaker. It had a ton of vibration. Wasn't really a big fan of that overall performance in terms of the way the motor ran, or the fact that it shook the motor mounts loose and everything loose. She said you had to constantly keep on top of the bolts on these things, so they would just rattle themselves to pieces. So again, a step forward, but certainly not the best open class machine available in 1980. For 1981, the KX420 was back with a minor list of updates. The basic machine was almost identical to 1980. In fact, if you look at the two back-to-back, they look almost identical. All the bodywork is the same. Really, the only visual difference is they did change the swing arm design. The 1980 used a very box section design. This 1981 has kind of an I-beam look to it. It's a little thinner through the middle. They were trying to adjust the flex characteristics of the swing arm a little bit this year. They also had a lot of problems with frame breakage in 1980. So the 81 frame, even though it's basically the same in overall design, there was some additional gusseting. They added some additional bracing in some significant areas around the steering stem and what have you that were problematic in 1980. They did have, as I said, some cracking issues. So they were trying to get away from that dreaded problem. Interestingly, for 1981, the forks remain a 38 millimeter. This was a pretty good sized fork in the 70s, but by 1981, a lot of the competition was moving on to 41 or even 43 millimeter forks. So these were some of the smallest forks in the class in 1981, and particularly on a big and heavy bike like the 420. This was not a great thing to have. On a small 125, you get away with the smaller forks a little bit, lighter bike, less power and what have you, but the KX420 was a heavy machine, and it would have benefited from a little stiffer front end, I think, in the overall handling department. When Cycle World tested this bike, they really raked it over the coals. The engine was basically the same as 1980, which meant it was not much low end, not much top end, and a pretty significant kind of bark in the middle. They commented on how narrow the power was, how much it vibrated. They couldn't stand how much it vibrated. These things were real shakers. They said the vibration gives you the impression that the bike was going to be powerful, but then it just didn't really go anywhere. I mean, obviously, relatively speaking, I'm sure it was fast compared to a 125 or something, but when they tested it back-to-back with Honda's new CR450, no great machine in its own right, and the Yamaha YZ465, they said it lost in drag races by 4 and 5 bike lengths every time. Definitely not one of the great days. They also said it was one of the spookiest handling motorcycles they'd ever ridden. They hated the riding position. They said in the sand it was a death trap, and just a very, very, very uninspired design overall, particularly in light of the fact that it was the second year for the machine. After taking 3 years off to get the open class bike right, and then having an 81 be the second year of this new design, they were hoping that they would do a little more to kind of get the bike sorted out. Now, they did make a few changes that were improvements in some areas. The shock was updated for 1981. They went to an aluminum shock body. It was a little bit lighter. They also changed it to be a little easier to adjust the damping without having to disassemble a bunch of stuff to get to it. So it's a little easier to service, and they changed the spring and stuff for this year, so it's a little more plush and compliant. Like I said, a lot of people thought the 80 was really too stiff in the back, and the new shock, damping, and new spring for 1981 did improve the damping slightly. Basically, these Unitracks, they got pretty good reviews on the smaller bikes. The people loved them on the KDX and on the KX125, but it seemed like the bigger the CCs went up, the more this new Unitrack had trouble kind of controlling the bike. And the 420 was really a handful, I think, by most accounts. In pretty much every situation, it wouldn't be the bike to choose, I think, in 1981. After receiving a drubbing in the press in 1981, Kawasaki completely scrapped their 420 in 1982. Did not even offer an open class bike in 1982, much like they had done in 1977. They went back and figured they'd start from scratch. The KX returned to the 500 class in 1983 with an all-new machine. Now, this machine is a clean sheet, I would say even more so than the 1980 design, because they went with an all-new motor this year. They upped the CCs to 499, making it a full 500. They upgraded the forks to 43 millimeters, much larger than 1980. The Unitrack was redesigned as well, though it still used the original dog bone, quote-unquote dog bone style linkage. It's an aluminum big link this year. It has all new bodywork. I've never been a fan of this body. In fact, I hate this body design, this weird rear fender. I never have understood why Kawasaki went with this thing. I thought it was quite funky in 1983. Don't think it really has improved with time. I know there are people who care for it, but I always thought it looked silly with the big silencer hanging out there. But that aside, the machine is much lighter. It's like 10 pounds lighter, in spite of being many more large components including the motor being larger. The bike's lighter. They added a lot more aluminum alloy stuff. Adds disc brake this year. In 1983, Kawasaki is the only manufacturer putting a disc brake on the front of their bike. So there's a lot to, looking on paper, it looks like a much improved machine in most every way. But the bike really was a flawed machine from the beginning. The main problem was the new motor was like a time bomb waiting to happen. It had terrible problems with detonation. If you left it stock and you ran it hard, it was going to blow up. All the magazines, when they tested them, they locked up their motors, had serious problems with it. You basically had to have the head done to get the bike to run right. If you ran it stock, you're going to have to really, really rich in the jetting and play with the ignition timing to try to keep the thing from blowing itself to bits, and then the bike ran poorly. So if you did get the head fixed, it was a very powerful engine. Still had a big vibration problem. They complained about how bad it vibrated. The bike itself is very tall and long, and much like the earlier ones, just didn't handle very well. The new 43mm forks did perform much better. The bike's suspension is not terrible by any means. It's not but the worst in the class this year. Mainly the problem is the engine and the handling of the bike. 500s in general are not particularly nimble, and this was a really unnimble machine. Like I said, when the magazines tested it, it was really pretty much panned, mainly for the poor motor. They just couldn't understand how it came out with an all-new bike, and it's really unrefined and had a problem staying in one piece. So definitely not a great comeback effort in 1983. For 1984, Kawasaki made a fair amount of updates to the KX500. You have an all-new tank and a works type up-the-tank saddle, thinner through the middle, and also, of course, protects your family jewels if you slide forward for turns. Does improve the looks of the bike a little bit as well. I like the new blue seat. That's a good looking improvement in my opinion as well. Still has the funky rear fender. Only the KX125 and then the Minis had the kind of more traditional updated look in 1984. Again, I think some people like this overall design. It's not my favorite. I will say the silver offset versus the gold in 1983 does look a little more classy, a little less garish in my opinion. In addition to the slight little updates in the plastic, you have all new forks with greater adjustability. They redesigned the shock this year as well, changed the linkage around to be a little bit lighter and more adjustable. The engine, as I said earlier, had some serious problems in 1983. So for 1984, they added an all-new flat-slide McCuney carburetor to hopefully get it to run a little better. They also redesigned the head completely and added a dual. They ran a lower compression and had a dual spark head, and that was in an attempt to try and stop all the detonation issues of 1983. It was still air cooled, of course. In '84, all the open class two strokes are still air cooled at this point, so that wasn't really much of a big hindrance. It no longer had the only disc brake in the field. Honda also got a disc brake in the front in 1984. Now, I don't know whether this is because the magazines just hated the KX the year before, or whether Kawasaki, because the bike was just raked over the coals, didn't want to give any test units, but neither motocross action or dirt bike included the KX500 in their 500 shootouts in 1984. Again, I don't know if that's indicative of the fact that the KX just was so uncompetitive they didn't want to test it. I think it's more a case of I think Kawasaki didn't much care for getting so royally panned in all the tests and more or less made fun of. And I don't think they probably gave them bikes to test this year. But for whatever reason, again, the KX500 was kind of out in the cold this year, and definitely not one of the best machines in the 500 class yet once again. All right, for 1985, we get another all-new KX500, and after a decade and a half of basically utter futility in the open class, Kawasaki finally gets their act together in 1985. This all-new machine is redesigned from the ground up. This is the first year they went to liquid cooling. It's a good-looking motorcycle. They went to the more, what I would say, traditional, conventional styling. I actually think it still looks good now. Basically, a really improved bike in every way. The machine definitely ran better. This switch to liquid cooling seemed to cure a lot of the pinging issues. It could still detonate if you got the bike really hot, like you're running in deep sand, or if you were to obviously not run really good gas in the bike. They said it would ping in extreme situations, but it was way less than it was doing with the old air-cooled KXs, which were just, pinging rattle traps. This bike runs much better. The power is much wider. The suspension still uses the old-style Unitrack, but it's got more adjustment built in. It has all new forks. As I said, all new from the ground up. The bike was still not yet the best bike in the 500 class, but it was way more competitive than previous efforts. It's pretty telling that it actually was included in all the shootouts this year. So clearly the magazines thought it was worthy of actually, considering within the others as a competitive mount. Big improvement. This Kawasaki definitely was finally getting things pointing in the right direction in the 500 class, and this 85 is a huge improvement in every way. After a complete redesign in 1985, the KX500 was back for 1986 with a pretty significant update. This is the first year that they added the KIP system, the Kawasaki Integrated Power Valve System, to the KX500, and it made the Kawasaki the only 500 at the time with a power valve in the class. Now, this broadened the power significantly, gave the machine a smoother delivery, and this is one of the things that these big bore 500s always had an issue with. They had no problem making power, but making that power over a broad range and having it come on in such a way that wasn't going to rip your arms out of your sockets was always the main concern. The CR500s in this era were ridiculously powerful bikes, but they just hit like a ton of bricks and were really tiring to ride. Very difficult to control. If you got tired, it was easy to whiskey throttle the thing and end up on your head. And this KIPS motor really took a little bit of that bite out of that 500 two-stroke. I mean, it's still an intimidating machine to ride, but certainly way better than any previous Kawasaki motors. And the engine, was described as being kind of electric. Again, that's probably maybe a bit of an exaggeration. These are really powerful motorcycles, but compared to like the really hard-hitting CR500, the Kawasaki this year felt much easier to manage. The bike does look very similar on the outside Cosmetically, the only real difference you'll see is the rear disc. They added a rear disc here for 1986. This is a big deal, of course, on a big, powerful bike. You want to be able to stop it. A lot of people had issues, though. These early Cowie discs were really grabby. I had an 87 KX, and the thing was like a light switch. And, if you're used to the more progressive feel of drum brakes, it was kind of a bit of a shock when you first get on these things with the discs and how much more powerful they were. They're not powerful in the way a modern KTM is, certainly, and modern brakes are more powerful than these, but the modern brake is much more progressive. Some of these early ones were really kind of an on-off feel, and they gave some riders an issue in 1986. In addition to the rear brake, they changed the weight bias a little bit. They moved the seat and tank 15 millimeters farther forward on the frame for 86 to get a little more weight on the front end. Again, that was kind of like the bugaboo of these Kawasaki's in the 80s. They weren't great turners, and they were trying to get a little more, a little more weight to the front wheel to get the bike to respond a little better in the turns. It was definitely a little better for 1986, but it was still not a shredder in the way the CR was. The Kawasaki was, very much a middle-of-the-road handler in this era. And they weren't terrible handling bikes in the mid-80s here, but they weren't by any means what you would call like a very nimble handler. In addition to the different weight bias, they also added an all-new shock for 1986. Changed the strut here. It's has a little more adjust. You can actually adjust the length. If you look at the dog bone strut in this era, you can actually lengthen and shorten it. It's interesting design. This is the last year for this original large dog bone link Unitrack. This had been introduced in 1980, and they produced it with very obviously variations through the years through 1986. Here, this is the last year. The 125 this year got the new bottom link, which is more like basically a Honda Pro Link clone. The KX125 is interesting. Seems to be the one that they're putting the most new technology onto in the Kawasaki line. It was the first one to get liquid cooling, of course. Also the first one to get the new bodywork in '84. And in '86 they moved to the new bottom link design on the KX125, while the 500 and 250 stay with the old design. The bike, though, is a much better machine. Clearly, this is probably the first one that Kawasaki could kind of hold its head high and say they really had a winning machine. Really, the only thing that people didn't really care for this year was the forks. This is a year when Honda went to the cartridge forks on their CR500, and Kawasaki had a version of a fork called a travel control valve Kiyaba made, which never worked very well. Yamaha used a very similar design, and neither one of them were very good in '86. And this bike handled pretty decently. The shock was very good. The motor was awesome, but the forks were pretty terrible. But that still wasn't enough to knock it out of the top spot. Motocross Action actually picked it as the top 500 in 1986, which is something obviously you couldn't have believed a few years before when they were being ridiculed for how terrible the KX500 was. So this is a big, big step forward for Kawasaki, and really, this year is when Kawasaki really kind of starts becoming a major contender in the 250 and the 500 division. The bikes were getting much, much better. For 1987, Kawasaki introduced an all-new design on their KX500. It's pretty remarkable. This is a one-year bike. Literally, they only produced it 1 year. When you think how the KX500 languished in the 90s with basically just bold new graphics and a few suspension tweaks for more than a decade, it's pretty amazing how quickly times changed there. In the 80s, you're getting the all-new CR500s, all-new KX500s, sometimes only available for 1 year before they would scrap the design and start fresh again. So this 87 is unique in that way. You get an all-new frame this year. They made some changes to the engine as well. It still uses the KIP system, of course, but it has an all-new pipe. They changed the porting. They massaged the KIP system, and that was all designed to give the bike a little more grunt. Not that any 500 probably needs more low-end power, but Kawasaki, it seems like on their 250 and their 500 this year, are really going for torque, and this bike had it in spades. You have all new bodywork, and this is interesting as well because this is a very slim bike. For 500 standards, it's very narrow through the midsection, certainly way more narrow than the KX500s that would come after this. So this is a kind of a unique one-year body design as well for all the bodywork. This is the first year they went to the bottom link Unitrack, so they moved the linkage to below the swing arm, as it would be on Honda. Kind of pioneered this layout, and by '87, I believe all the manufacturers were using something very similar to the Pro Link. And I think it basically offered the best combination of mass centralization and performance. There's things like the full float and what have you were very large, and the same thing with the Unitrack. It carried, the bulk of the linkage was up high in the chassis, so it not only interfered with like where you could put your airbox, but also, of course, made the center of gravity higher. So by moving to this new Unitrack, they were able to get some of that weight down lower on the chassis. This new frame also encompasses a removable rear subframe, which is nice. For 87, they also made some improvements to the brakes. They enlarged the caliper size in the front, and Kawasaki claimed that gave them 20% more stopping power. The rear was also massaged a little bit to have smoother operation. I don't think anybody had any complaints as far as the power of the rear disc. It was just a little too grabby. So for 1987, they made some changes there. On the track, the KX500 was very competitive again. For 1987, Kawasaki once again stuck with the travel control valve forks, and that really kind of held them back from being the top 500 that year. The Honda's forks were way better. Unfortunately, they tried to save a little bit of money, and they wouldn't get the cartridges until a year later. That really kind of held it back in the standings. It was still kind of a middle-of-the-road handler. Some people did not really care for the new, more abrupt low end. The 86 motor was a little smoother, apparently. This engine still, overall, they described it as fairly electric, but it had a very abrupt tip in when you first gave it the throttle. The bike kind of wanted to leap forward, and if you weren't careful, it could get away from you. So the more low end, I don't think was probably a great move on a 500. It already had a ton of it, and some people had some issues with the bike being kind of hard to control, particularly in slippery situations. So there's a little more of a handful in 1987 than the year before, and that basically costed the shootout. In Motocross Action picked the CR500 as the better machine this year, although it was much certainly much closer than it had been in the past when the KX wasn't even competitive. The 86 machine probably better in some ways as far as the smoothness of the engine, but the 87 I think was a very, very competitive machine nonetheless. All right, for 1988, we get the introduction of the machine that would basically see the KX500 through to its final retirement in 2004. This basic design would not change a whole lot over the next decade and a half, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. After a 1-year design, you get a 15-year design here with the KX500 in 88. The bodywork is all new. I really hated this change in 1988. I did not like that. I still don't really care for this weird rear fender. It's a giant shovel. Always thought it would look ridiculous. Apparently Kawasaki had heard some people, test riders, complaining that they were catching their butt on the back of the seat when they were sliding rearward in the whoops. So they raised the top of the fender to make it more, I guess, flush. But then you end up with the problem with if the rear end kicked, you had that hard plastic fender was more likely to whack in the butt. That aside, I didn't really just thought the thing looked silly. But another change they made was they upped the capacity of the tank slightly. The slimmer 87 tank had been great for ergonomics, but it apparently had a little bit less capacity, and some people thought it needed a little more. So for 88, they bumped that up. This big giant tank is definitely got, I think it's got like almost 2.5 gallons, 2.4, I think. No, I'm sorry, 2.6 according to the brochure. So it's got plenty of capacity for long motos, or if you're going to do a little off-road riding on it. The chassis is completely new this year. They went with a green frame, has a little different look. I do like the green frame with the silver engine. That's an overall change that does give the bike a little more modern appearance. Big change in the suspension end. You get an all-new Unitrack, still bottom link design for 88. And you finally get cartridge forks. These are 43 millimeter cartridge Kayaba forks in the front. Huge quantum leap in terms of performance over the 87 non-cartridge travel control valve forks. The Kawasaki finally has competitive suspension here in 1988. The motor gets some changes too. They, of course, added a new pipe to go with the new bodywork and what have you. Changed the porting, gets a new head. Still uses the KIP system. And they also went with a 39 millimeter PWK carburetor, a little more modern carburetor that seemed to make a pretty significant difference in terms of the carburation and response of the motor. Kawasaki claims 2 extra horsepower on top for the 88 model, and the carburetor is supposed to give it much quicker throttle response as well. The automatic compression system built into the KIPs also made it a little easier to start than like the CR500, which was nice. This bike, it's a decent handler, certainly a better handler than 87. The suspension is much better. The motor is a little less abrupt. Like I said, the 87 was really punchy, and a lot of people had some issues with that. So this 88 model is certainly much smoother. They went back to the more 86 style power in 88, and I think everybody thought that was a big improvement. This is really a big pussycat of a 500. It was certainly easier to manage than the CR500, which was, had a more explosive hit. Really good overall motorcycle. I think it was... The Honda at this point, the 88 Honda, was a couple-year-old design in terms of the bodywork. Neither one of these things is really narrow. They're both pretty fat machines. So I don't think the fact that the Kawasaki was much more fat and portly feeling this year was too much of a detriment, because the Honda was certainly didn't feel like the featherweight either. You'd have to wait another year for the Honda to get the all-new bodywork in '89. So that part wasn't much of a detriment. So if you look at the shootouts and tests this year, the CR and the KX are pretty much neck and neck, depending on the condition, what kind of track you're. If you're on a track that was much tighter, the Honda did turn a little better. The KX was more stable, so it really kind of depended on where you were going to ride it as to which one was a better bike. But this Kawasaki in this year in '88 was a very competitive bike, an excellent machine, and certainly worthy of keeping the KX going till the very end. For '89, the KX500 was back with what looked to be visually not much in the way of changes, but underneath the skin, there was actually a lot of stuff that changed in 1989. Probably of most interest, originally this bike was supposed to come with a set of 41mm inverted cartridge forks. '89 is kind of the era where you start seeing the transition to the inverted forks on the Japanese machines. Honda and Suzuki went with the inverted stuff in '89. Kawasaki originally was going to do that. Actually Yamaha as well, but they did not make this change. At the last minute, they decided to go with a set of 46mm conventional forks. So they were 3mm larger in diameter. They were similar to what Jeff Ward and Ron Lachine had used on their works bikes in '88. And apparently the American test riders weren't happy with the performance of the 41mm inverted forks initially, so they made this kind of last second change. Interestingly, this was only in like the U.S. bound bikes. I'm not sure if Canada got them or not, but bikes in Europe and Japan, they went with the 41mm inverted. So you see a lot of photos of the '89 KXs with inverted forks. In fact, when I first saw the early previews of the bike in like Dirt Bike and Motocross Action, they came with pictures of inverted forks that would never make it to production, at least here in the U.S. So this bike, again, from the outside, doesn't look a whole lot different, but they changed the frame material here to be a little more durable. As I'd said, some of these Kawasaki's had issues with cracking frames, and they apparently went with a higher quality steel in '89. They also changed the steering head angle to be a little more aggressive, pulled in it a little bit to try and get the bike to turn a little better. The forks, as I said, were stiffer, the 46mm larger diameter forks. In order to cope with the additional stiffness, they also beefed up the steering stem. They added new hubs front and rear, and this is the first year where they went to a 19-inch rear on the bike to give it a little better cornering performance. The off-road guys probably didn't love this. It was more prone to flats, but for motocross, it gave a little better feel to the rear end. The disc brake was new. They added new rotors that were 3mm thinner. They also changed a lot of little things on the bike to save weight for 1989. The bike's actually almost 5 pounds lighter. So again, it doesn't look a lot different on the outside, but it's almost 5 pounds lighter on the scales. Now, it did not get the new smaller tank. The '89 KX250 actually got a reduced capacity tank that was a little lower profile. A lot of people have said really not loved the bulbous feel of the previous tank. I believe these tanks are pretty coveted now. A lot of guys with KX500s want to stick them on their bikes, but they probably pretty much dried up at this point. But the tank was a little slimmer on the 250, but the 500 did not get the benefit of that. Now on the engine side, the Kawasaki actually made another big change. They went in 1988. They updated the KIP system on the 250 to add a third valve, meaning that it not just they added like a guillotine style valve, kind of like what Yamaha's system and Honda's Honda PowerPort were used. And this third valve was, to broaden the power slightly, make the engine a little more smooth. And for '89, they added this third valve to the KIP system. So now it had 3 valves inside it. That, of course, necessitated an all-new cylinder to accommodate that. So this bike, again, even though it looks very similar, underneath the skin, there's a lot of changes. The silencer is also 28mm longer to be a little quieter. On the track, this was a phenomenal motorcycle. The bike handled very well, turning was sharper, the engine was smoother. They basically, all the magazine tests, basically said this was the ultimate open class bike in 1989. The CR500 this year did get new bodywork, which was slimmer, had the low boy layout. I love the looks of the Honda. It definitely looks sleeker than this Kawasaki, but the inverted forks on the Honda were not very good. In fact, they were absolutely atrocious. Terrible performers. Honda ended up recalling them halfway through the year. They were so bad, and that allowed the Kawasaki pretty much to dominate all the shootouts. This KX500 was considered the best open class bike Kawasaki had ever produced, and easily the best open class bike of 1989. Just a phenomenal machine from top to bottom. For 1990, there were some really big changes in store for the Kawasaki camp, but unfortunately those changes did not make it to the 500. This is the first year for the all-new perimeter frame and the spacey new bodywork on the KX125 and KX250. I will say from my personal experience, I was completely blown away by these bikes at the time. I thought they were the coolest looking machines I'd ever seen. Really, really, unique and cutting edge machines at the time. As I said, the 500 did not get this update in 1990. A lot of people at the time thought it would surely come in like 1991 or 92. In this year, in 1990, Dave Thorpe and I believe Billy Lyles were racing works versions of the KX500, the SR500 in Europe with a perimeter chassis, but the bike apparently was not well liked. In fact, Dave Thorpe went back to the regular standard old-fashioned KX chassis like mid-year, so that did not seem to work out, and they never made this transition on the 500s. In 1990, the 500 does get a little bit of update the graphics. Of course, you change the color scheme a little bit. I do really like this move to the lighter blue for the seat and the kind of, I guess, pastel colors. The graphics in 1990 were one of my favorites. I think it's a good-looking graphic, even though the rest of the bike really doesn't look much different. You do get inverted forks finally, the forks that the rest of the international buyers got in 1989 made their way to the KX500 in the US in 1990, retiring the much-loved 46 millimeter standard Kiaba forks. Now, with this update, they also added some additional gusseting to the steering head. The inverted forks, one of the things about them were they're much stiffer. And in the front end, they had to beef up the front end a little bit to withstand that additional torque those forks were going to put on the chassis. This bike actually, ironically enough, ended up being probably the best handling machine in the KX lineup this year. The new perimeter frame, while super cool to look at, was big and tall and wide. And the bike was not, I would not say it's the best handling, certainly machine in the 250 and 125 class this year. It was really a trick to look at, but this first generation frame was not really what you would call a handler. And this KX500 actually, in spite of being, a fairly large motorcycle, the bodywork was still kind of bulky and what have you, actually turned very well and was very stable at speed. Great handling machine. And actually was probably the best machine in the KX lineup this year in spite of being a bit old-fashioned in terms of its bodywork. So, good bike, little minor refresh in terms of the appearance. Certainly not as trick as the 250 and 125 in the looks department, but a great motorcycle nonetheless. For 1991, the KX500 did not get the much anticipated switch to a perimeter frame, but it did get an all-new fork. They bumped the fork size up from 41 millimeters to 43 millimeters this year, and visually you can tell they went to the blue anodizing look. This is kind of a polarizing change. I personally never cared for this very much. This and Yamaha kind of did the same thing in this year by putting a red anodized fork on their YZ lineup. I mean, again, I know there are people who love it. I never really loved it. It tended to fade over time. And this year they also had a revised rear end. They stiffened their swing arm in the back, added an all-new shock with some additional adjustability as well in the Unitrack suspension. You get a minor update to the graphics. It looks very similar to 91. Again, I kind of prefer the 91 graphics to these, but it's not a whole lot of difference there. The motor difference is only a minor, a little bit of some refinement. They took the connecting rod and polished it a little differently to be more durable. Other than that, the motor's the same. Still use the triple kips. Real powerhouse of the class by this point. It was considered, again, to be probably the best motor in the class by far and away. Good motorcycle again in 1991. The suspension's even better. In this era, Kawasaki really had the suspension dialed in. This early 90s era, the KX500 was an awesome machine with great suspension, and in a 500 particularly, maybe more than any other class, the suspension really plays an important role just because the bike has so much power and weight. If you have great suspension, it definitely gives you an advantage. And they definitely were kicking butt in that area in the early 90s here. The 91, 92, 93 era, really great for Kawasaki suspension. And that certainly gave the KX500 an advantage that was tough to beat. For 1992, the Kawasaki KX500 is back with a purely bold new graphics update. They changed nothing that I'm aware of in 1992, from best I can check from reading tests and looking at the brochures. Really, the only cosmetic difference is they added a green handlebar, and you have the graphics that kind of bleed into the seat and go across the tank. I will say it always struck me as kind of funny looking when you see these newer graphic treatments they were putting on the KX 125 and 250 with their kind of integrated one-piece shroud and more flowing seat design, and then kind of sticking it on the old-fashioned bodywork on the KX500. It looks kind of funny to me. It's particularly bad in 1996 when they go to the purple. Always looked a little weird, kind of anachronistic on this thing. And I don't know that it works that well, but again, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, as they say. The KX500 certainly was still a great machine, but by this point, that bodywork was already starting to look pretty stale. But unfortunately, Kawasaki wasn't too interested in updating any of that. I think if they had just updated the plastic on this thing, it really would have been, a much more desirable machine. But the fact that they just kind of kept the same look all those years, it just kept getting older and older looking every year. And unfortunately, putting new graphics on it weren't really going to change that. For 1993, you get some more bold new graphics, and these are certainly very bold. They put the B in bold here. I will admit that in 1993, I actually really love this look, at least on the 250 and the 125. One of my best friends bought a not brand new 1993 KX250, and I thought the thing looked great. I'm not so sure, again, it works quite as well on the 500 with the old bodywork, but I do much prefer this to the 1992 look. Still has the blue forks, not a giant fan of that, but I will say that this suspension system is excellent in these. My buddy's 1993 KX250 was a absolute magic carpet, particularly in comparison to my Honda at the time. Way better suspension on these things. And other than minor suspension tweaks and some like minor things they did to the brakes, they changed some of the pad material and what have you. These KX500s in this early 90s really didn't change a whole lot. One year to the next was not a whole lot of difference. It is interesting to note, though, that Kawasaki in the late 80s, as I said, they'd had really powerful brakes that were almost too powerful. They're kind of grabby. But here in the early 90s, they made some changes to the brake line material, the pad material, and they ended up with brakes that worked progressively worse. They weren't nearly as powerful as what was on the Hondas, and they had a real mushy feel at the lever. I remember that, like some of my buddies Kawasaki, it never really had a firm feel at the lever and always felt like you needed to bleed the brakes, whereas my Honda had a much more, confident feel, and that was a real problem with all these bikes, particularly the 500s, which are so powerful. You definitely want brakes that work, and one of the things that people complained about on these early 90s KXs were the brakes just weren't up to par. So I think if you bled them constantly and ran like Motul oil, then there were a couple of tricks that would get them to work a little bit better, but they were definitely a step behind the CRs of this, at least in that department. Suspension was way better, but the braking was definitely a step behind the Hondas at the time. Here for 1994, we get one of my favorite looking Kawasaki's of the 90s. I love the look of the KX250 and 125 this year. This probably is my favorite graphics package. But I think it works even on the KX500. I like the shift to the purple seat this year. I think it looks great against the green plastic. Some of this color combination is really good looking. Just a little bit of purple accents. Not quite as whole hog as they went in 96 certainly, but overall I think it looks good. The graphics here are limited to the shroud, which seems, at least in my opinion, works better with this older body style that doesn't have the graphics bleeding into the tank. Good looking motorcycle. As far as changes for 1994, they're very minimal. Again, Kawasaki is chasing that whole brake feel problem they had. And so for 94, they revised the calipers, changed the front pads and rear master cylinder, and also tweaked the brake hose material to try and improve braking power and feel. On the suspension side of things, they recalibrated the suspension settings on the 43mm forks to perform better this year. Kawasaki suspension, again, was excellent in this era, and the KX500 had some really good suspension performances, particularly for a big, powerful machine. Although it did not, I don't believe it got some of the updates that the 250 got in terms of suspension. In 94, they added a all-new coating to the fork tubes to get less stiction, and of course, totally redesigned the Unitrack as well with the new frame for 94, and the KX500 did not get that update. But overall, a good-looking motorcycle. As far as making this old bodywork look good, I think they did a really good job of it in 1994. For 1995, the KX500 was back with an even shorter list of updates. The only thing they changed this year is they changed the brake pad material. Again, trying to improve the performance of the brakes was a major focus in this era of KX500. And of course, they also added the ubiquitous bold new graphics. It's interesting in 95 here, they had like a little respite from some of the crazier graphics, and this is pretty understated in my opinion. Even though it does bleed into the tank, it actually works pretty well. Overall, I'd say this is a pretty good looking motorcycle. I do prefer the 94, but the 95 is certainly, by 90 standards, pretty low key, and actually doesn't look bad with this bodywork at all. For 1996, we get a significant update in terms of appearance, certainly. This is a year where I thought Kawasaki kind of lost their mind. I remember in 96, I just hated the looks of these 96 KXs. For some reason, the all purple look was what they went with. Again, I like green with the purple accents. 94, beautiful bike, great looking motorcycles. This all purple though, man, I was just not on board with it. The lower purple fork guards and all of it, even on the 250 and the 125, it doesn't look great in my opinion. On the 500, I really thought it looked goofy. Making the whole side plate white makes it look half-baked. It doesn't really look very finished. The purple tank, I just thought it was weird. I know a lot of people probably dig this for its 90s uniqueness, and now actually it's kind of grown on me a little bit, but certainly back then I just could not stand it. Much like the 1995 purple CRs, I just didn't think it was a good look, but in any case, that's purely a matter of opinion, certainly. As far as updates this year, the KX actually did get some updates. They added the 1995 KX250 fork, which was still 43 millimeters, but featured a different valving system and some new springs, obviously a little bit stiffer in the 500. The new fork was more rigid and had a mid-speed compression valve and a revised oil lock system to provide smoother damping and prevent harsh bottoming. They also had a new handlebar, which was stolen from the KX250 from 1995, which was 7 millimeters lower. Exciting stuff here. And of course, the every year tweaking of the brakes. This year they added a stiffer rear brake caliper and front caliper to give a more rigid feel, to try and reduce that spongy feel and add a little more firmness to the overall braking experience on the KX500. For 1997, you get one major update and a list of fairly minor tweaks on the KX500. First thing you'll notice, obviously, it went back to a much more understated look. The crazy purple of 96 was ditched. I'm not sure how everybody thought about that at the time, but Kawasaki quickly went back to a more traditional look. I actually like the graphics here in 97. That's a good look as well, although I think the bike would have looked much better if they went with the green side plates with just a white background. But that aside, overall, this is a good-looking motorcycle in most respects. This 97 model does get a fork that's all new. Again, Kawasaki's kind of in a cycle where they'll put the new stuff on the 125 and 250. A year later, the 500 would get it. So in 96, the smaller bikes went to a 46 millimeter fork, and for 97, they brought that fork to the 500. That fork was obviously still an inverted fork at this point. You know, a lot of manufacturers were kind of playing with going back to conventional forks, but Kawasaki stuck with the inverted all the way through. In addition to the all-new fork system, which featured a redesigned damping system and a deeper oil lock for better bottoming resistance. They also added a stronger chain, something a 500 could always use, although I'm sure it was still probably butter. There's also a new, more durable gas cap with a check valve in the vent hose to prevent gas from barfing all over your front fender, which is always a nice tweak. A lot of people added those aftermarket. That was always a nice thing to have, so you didn't get that gas coming out all the time when you filled your tank all the way up. They also added a new hub with 3-wheel bearings and a better seal. They beefed up the steering stem by making it steel instead of aluminum. And of course, the ubiquitous, bold new graphics and a switch back to green for the tank. It's interesting to note that by this point, obviously the 500 KX was pretty old. The basic body design went back to 1988, and you started to see a little more competition in the 500 class. Honda really wasn't interested in updating theirs, but you saw increased competition from like brands like Husaberg, which were kind of pioneering the four-stroke revolution, and of course KTM, which came out with their 360 in the mid-90s, and it was giving some riders a option of a little bit, maybe a little less powerful machine, but certainly a more up-to-date chassis in terms of ergonomics and what have you. The KTM, I don't think, was ever the best bike. Another buddy might have one of these KTM 360s in this era, and I thought it was kind of a handful, but it was a more modern layout. The 500 was still a really competitive mount off-road, though. They were doing great work out in the desert. By this point, the Nationals had stopped racing the 500, so it really wasn't getting the attention it used to get, at least in the U.S. In Europe, they were still riding the 500 class, but I think by this point, even in Europe, it was mostly all four-strokes, maybe the occasional KTM. But for the most part, unfortunately, this bike was not getting the kind of attention that would have generated a lot of interest from buyers, I don't think. For 1998, the KX500 is back with no mechanical changes. The changes are purely cosmetic this year. They added the green seat, which actually I don't really care for. Never did like this all green look as much as the having some kind of a little bit of a contrast there. They also have the Works replica graphics, which at least to my eye look comical on this thing. The actual Works graphics this year on the smaller bikes look great. The 96, 97 factory Kawasaki's were easily, in my opinion, one of the best looking machines of the 90s. And kind of sticking it on the 500 here looks kind of ridiculous. It just clearly, they didn't make much effort to have any of this work well with these graphics. I just don't really care for the overall look. Again, I think the bike would look better with the purple seat like the Works bike had, and if they actually put a green side plate on it. But I'm sure it saved them 50 cents to go with white and not bother putting number plate background on it or painting it. So I'm sure that's what the reasoning there was. Really, the big news this year in '98 is the arrival of the Yamaha YZ400F, which kind of starts the transition to four-stroke. So it was the first serious, at least, mainstream motocross bike. Husaberg, Husqvarna, and them had been obviously producing some four-strokes in the early '90s, late '80s, but they didn't really catch on with any kind of a mainstream audience. But the arrival of the YZ400 kind of rekindled the 500 class. Today, of course, everybody rides basically 500s. The 450 class is the open class, even though it's kind of supplanted the 250s in terms of the mainstream of motocross. But that was really kind of showing that there was potential in an open class bike if you put a little money into refining the package, refining the ergonomics, and what have you. The KX500 was still faster, obviously, than YZ400F, but it didn't handle as nimbly. The 400F was actually still heavier than this. Not that the KX500 is a lightweight. But it had, a much more modern feel, and the engine was easier to control. The big 500 two-stroke, as smooth as this KX500 is, it's not as smooth as that electric feeling YZ400F was, and really kind of signaled the nail in the coffin for the 500s moving forward. For 1999, the KX500 was back with another bold new graphic update, although I would not really call these bold, actually. They're pretty much unbold in my opinion. They're still using the green seat, which I wasn't a big fan of. Overall, though, the bike doesn't look bad, certainly. The real big news in the Kawasaki camp for 99 was an all-new KX125 and 250 redesigned perimeter frame, all-new bodywork, major updates. 250 in particular was a good machine this year. The 500, though, did not get the perimeter frame again, did not really get anything this year. It was completely the same as 1998, which was completely the same as 1997. For the year 2000, you get a minor tweak to the graphics, a very minor tweak, although we'll say I kind of like these a little bit better, but again, it really looks the same more or less. The bike wasn't changed in any significant way for 2000. By this point, the magazines weren't even testing the KX500 anymore. It actually starts to become pretty hard to find any information about the bike at all, even in all the model updates. The best you get is a passing reference to the fact that the KX500 still exists and got some new graphics. By this point, all the open class shootouts were going fully four-stroke with the all-new YZ426F and KTM 520, and bikes like the VORs and Husqvarnas at the time were certainly taking the lion's share of the interest of open-class riders. These big two-strokes were still very competitive in the desert. The KX500 continued to be a great desert sled till the very end, but for motocross, I think that ship had pretty much sailed at this point. For 2001, the big news on the KX500 is the arrival of a black seat. That's pretty much it. The graphics this year are a little tweaked. They're not particularly bold, but they are different. I'm not so sure if I like the black seat better than the green seat. To me, the best looking of these KXs was certainly the 94. There really is no other changes for 2001. Kawasaki at this point not interested in sinking any more money into the machine, so the best you can hope for is a change in the seat cover year to year. 2002 is another bold new graphics year. This is significant for one reason, in that it is the last year for the green tank on the KX500. Actually, these graphics don't look bad. They do a pretty good job of kind of masking over the old bodywork, and I think it does look a little better with the black seat and what have you. It kind of works. Not a great sleek machine by any means. None of these bikes were, but of this era of KX500, I think these graphics work the best. Other than that, mechanically, no changes for 2002. For 2003, you get an all-new look on the KX500. The bodywork is the same, aside from a switch to the black tank, which I'm not a big fan of. In fact, I hate the look of the black tank. I think it makes the bike look cobby, like somebody's desert sled. But be that as it may, you have a switch to kind of a gunmetal color for the frame. This is the first frame change in terms of color since 1988, so it's a pretty significant visual difference here for 2003. Kind of a throwback to the early 80s when Kawasaki was using those silver frames. I love the looks of the forks this year. I don't think mechanically they're any different, but the outer tubes are anodized kind of a goldish amber color like the Works bikes, and I thought this was a really good look in 2003. I don't think Kawasaki used it more than maybe 1 or 2 years, but it was a good look, and it definitely gives the machine a different appearance on the outside, if nothing else. The graphics this year actually pretty good looking. The overall, all the KXs I thought were good looking in 2003. The 250 and the 125 were all new this year, but of course, once again, the bike is stuck using the ancient chassis, so they weren't going to spend any money on that at this point, but it does get a little bit of an update in terms of appearance at least. All right, so we've reached the end of the line for the mighty KX500. This 2004 model is the last year that Kawasaki produced it. They would very shortly be adding the KX450F to the lineup in, I guess, 2006. And this is the last year for the big, mighty two-stroke. It's interesting, if you look at the literature this year, they don't even mention motocross hardly at all. It talks about the KX500 winning Baja 1000 more times than any other motorcycle, also winning the 2002 AMA Hare and Hound Championship, and the Best in the Desert Championship. So clearly Kawasaki knew at this point their KX500 was kind of pigeonholed as an off-road desert sled, but it was great at that. It was a really, really phenomenal machine in the desert. The more stable handling certainly made it a much more popular desert machine than the CR500. At this point, the CR500 was already retired. I think 2001 was the last year for it. So it is to their credit that they kept making it a couple years after that. So if you were looking for an open class 500, really the Kawasaki was the only choice at this point. And it was a awesome machine for many years. They had some issues with, some of the jetting wasn't great on these things, but once you tweaked them a little bit, it was a really competitive machine in its element. By motocross standards at this point, obviously, it wasn't really competitive with the newer four strokes, but the KX500 still was a great, do-it-all machine. If you're looking for something you could basically never have to worry about rebuilding. Certainly, if you're concerned about, maintenance, this 500 was probably 10 times less costly to own than like a four-stroke. If the top end went on this thing, it was pretty easy. You could fix it yourself, and it wasn't any major thing. If you grenaded a 426 or something, you were looking for a pretty expensive rebuild. So these bikes certainly had their place, but the fact that they had not updated it in a decade really kind of let you know that Kawasaki, kind of seen the writing on the wall in the mid '90s and just said, we're just going to keep pumping these out as long as we can. And I imagine probably the sales had dwindled to this point where it just didn't make any sense anymore. So unfortunately, Kawasaki finally ceased production on certainly one of the most successful machines in desert racing, and when it was in its prime, at least, one of the best machines you could buy for motocross as well. So there you have it. That's a look back at the history of Kawasaki's two-stroke machines. Over the years, obviously, Kawasaki had some hits and misses, as all manufacturers do, but really that last generation of KX500 probably was the best the open class two-stroke ever got. They were, really, really well regarded in their time. Definitely between that and the Honda, that was a real close battle, depending on whether you're looking for something a little more abrupt or something a little smoother. The Honda, I think, had it in terms of ergonomics, but the Kawasaki had better suspension and a better motor by most regards. If you see how popular open class bikes are now with all these 450s, again, if you really brought this machine back and put some modern stuff on it, I think it would be a very, very popular. Obviously, there's a lot of us that grew up with two strokes, are very nostalgic about them now. But in the '90s, people were just, didn't even want to have any time for these bikes. They barely were in production. Suzuki and Yamaha had already bailed on them. And the Kawasaki, to their credit, kept it going for longer even than Honda did. They were the last one to abandon the 500 class and one of the first ones to get involved. So Kawasaki stuck with it a long time. The KX became, more known for its desert, as a desert sled towards the end. They'd, after, I guess, 94, I think, was the last year. Maybe it was 93, was the last year for the 500 class in national motocross competition. They still raced them in Europe, of course. But here in the U.S., it kind of just was deprecated. And, towards the end, though, they were very competitive in the desert. They won a lot of races, as an off-road machine. So it definitely was a niche for the KX500. Again, one of those iconic machines for sure. That I've actually never had one. I've had several Honda 500s. Like I said, my buddy Jamie has one at KX now. It's actually a really impressive bike. It's surprisingly easy to ride considering how powerful it is. And I think that's one of the things that Kawasaki did right when they finally got it sorted out. Like I said, they had some really crazy death machines early on, but towards the end, they definitely had the 500 formula figured out. So if you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the other videos I've done. If you could like, subscribe, share on social media. If you want to pick up some Motocross Vault merch, I would very much appreciate that as well. So until we meet again, this is Tony Blazier for the Motocross Vault. Keep the rubber side down. Peace.